Sunlight hammers off the aluminum canopy rail as Captain Quentin Aanenson pushes the P-47's nose down toward a road that has stopped moving. Below him, near a French village called Chambois, the traffic is nose to tail for 2 miles, and none of it is going anywhere. Trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons, and the long angular shapes of Panther and Panzer IV tanks sit jammed against one another in the August heat. He rolls in from 13,000 feet, thumb on the trigger, and the .850 caliber guns of the Thunderbolt walk a line of fire straight up the column. One tank brews up, then the truck behind it, then the fuel Bowser behind that. He climbs, banks, and does it again, and there is nobody shooting back. That afternoon over the Falaise pocket, Allied fighter bombers claimed hundreds of German vehicles destroyed in a matter of hours. And here is the number that should not be possible. Post-war survey teams walked that ground and counted the actual wrecks, and the tally of armor and transport abandoned or wrecked inside the pocket ran into the thousands. An entire German field army was ground to scrap from the air in less than a week. It was not outmaneuvered, not encircled and starved, but shot to pieces from above while it tried to drive home in daylight. Before I take you any further into this, do something for me. Write in the comments what you think a German tank crew feared most in the summer of 1944, the Sherman, the artillery, or the sky. Then, watch to the end and see if you were right. Subscribe and hit, like if I show you something about Falaise you were never taught, because the answer to that question changed how the entire Wehrmacht painted, parked, and drove its tanks for the rest of the war. The men doing the killing had a nickname for themselves in the after-action jargon, but the men on the receiving end had a better one. The Germans called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, hunter bomber. It was not an affectionate word. A panzer commander named Hans von Luck, who fought in Normandy with the 21st Panzer Division, described the feeling in flat terms after the war. The enemy air force dominated the battlefield completely, he wrote. Any movement by day was suicide. That is a professional soldier, a man who admired good tank work and respected a good enemy, telling you plainly that his branch of service, the branch that had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, could no longer use the daylight. The Jabos had taken it away from them. Think about what that actually means for an army. The German tank arm had built its entire reputation on movement, on speed, on getting to the decisive point faster than the other side could react. In 1940, they had driven through the Ardennes and reached the Channel before the French High Command finished writing its first set of orders. 4 years later, the grandsons of that doctrine were hiding under trees, waiting for dusk, moving their beautiful engineered machines only after the sun went down, because a single American fighter pilot with rockets and a full belt of ammunition could end a 50-ton Panther on a road he had never seen before. The Panther was arguably the best medium tank of the war. It did not matter. You cannot fight what you cannot reach, and by August, the German tanks could not reach the fight in daylight without dying on the way. The Thunderbolt itself was a brute, and I mean that as a compliment. It weighed nearly 8 tons empty, carried 8 machine guns, and could haul bombs and rockets under wings built like bridge trusses. Republic Aviation designed it around a turbocharged radial engine the size of a small car, which is why the fuselage has that distinctive barrel shape. Pilots joked you could hide behind the engine block if someone shot at you head-on, and some of them did exactly that and came home. Anyway, the airframe is not the point. The point is the system that put hundreds of them over a single French road on a single afternoon and kept them there day after day until an army stopped being an army and became a traffic jam full of corpses. Aanenson flew multiple sorties in that period, and he was not a man given to cheerful war stories afterward. Late in his life, he described what the ground looked like from the cockpit, the wrecked columns, the dead horses, the men who had crawled into ditches and did not crawl out. He said he did his job, and then he had to live with what the job looked like. The kill tallies leave that part out. Behind every one of those thousands of destroyed vehicles was a crew, some of them boys, some of them veterans of Russia, who had survived everything the Eastern Front could throw at them, only to burn on a road in Normandy because they tried to drive somewhere at noon. So here is the question this whole story turns on. When an army discovers that the sky no longer belongs to it, that daylight itself has become the enemy, what does it do? The German answer was strange, desperate, and revealing, and it started with paint. To understand why tank crews began smearing color across their own vehicles in a frantic attempt to disappear, we have to go back to how the Americans took the sky in the first place. Dust and diesel smoke drift over a Warsaw road in September 1939, and the German soldiers walking east barely bother to look up. When they do, the aircraft overhead are their own. Stukas peeling off in near-vertical dives, the sirens' Junkers had bolted to the landing gear screaming that famous falling note down onto Polish columns. For the men of the Panzer divisions in 1939 and 1940, the sky was a tool, a thing they owned and pointed at the enemy. In Poland, in France, in the first months of Russia, a German tanker learned to associate the sound of aircraft engines with good news. The dive bombers went ahead and broke things, and then the tanks drove through the gap. That was the arrangement. That was how the machine was supposed to work, and for 2 years it worked exactly like that, which is precisely why what happened later hit them so hard psychologically. You cannot lose something you never had. These men had it, held it, and used it, and then, over the course of 1943 and 1944, they watched it be taken away and handed to somebody else. The somebody else was American and British industry, and the shift did not announce itself with a single battle. It arrived as a slow inversion, a reversal of the natural order that the German ground soldier felt in his body long before his generals admitted it on paper. By Normandy, the sound of an aircraft engine no longer meant good news for a man in a tank. It meant, get off the road, get under the trees, get out and run. A German artillery officer captured in France put the arithmetic plainly to his interrogators. His battery could only move at night, could only fire a few rounds before displacing, because the moment a muzzle flash was spotted in daylight, the Jabos were overhead within minutes. The Thunderbolt's 8 Browning .50 calibers, incidentally, fired a round designed back in 1918 by John Moses Browning for an anti-aircraft and anti-tank role in the previous war, a cartridge so overbuilt for shooting men that it stayed in frontline service for a full century afterward. It could punch through the thin top and rear armor of a Panther if the pilot came in at the right angle, and the rockets could do worse. Anyway, the specific ballistics matter less than the habit the guns created. The habit was fear of the open sky, and it spread through the German army the way true rumors do, quietly and completely. We know how deep that fear ran because the British and Americans were listening. At a country house near London called Trent Park, captured German generals were housed in comfort, fed well, allowed to walk the grounds, and recorded by hidden microphones in nearly every room while they talked to one another with no idea their own words were being written down. The historian Sönke Neitzel published these transcripts, and they are the closest thing we have to the unguarded voice of the German High Command. The generals were not performing for interrogators in those conversations. They griped and boasted and confessed to each other, and the theme that comes up again and again is the air. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa, was recorded describing what Allied air power did to his movement long before Normandy, and the tone is not defiance, but a kind of exhausted disbelief that a modern army could be pinned in place by aircraft. One general after another circles the same wound. They had built a doctrine of speed, and the enemy had found a way to make speed lethal to the man attempting it. A panzer division that could not move in daylight was a fortress, and the whole point of a panzer division was that it was never supposed to be a fortress. It was supposed to be a spear. The Jabos turned the spear into a rock and then sat on top of the rock and hammered it. The word Jabo itself is the tell. Armies do not invent short, ugly, universal nicknames for threats they can manage. They invent them for the thing that rules their day, the thing every man in the column is thinking about, whether or not he says it out loud. British and American troops had their own version. They cursed the 88, the German dual-purpose gun that killed tanks and aircraft with equal ease. The Germans had the Jabo. Both words carry the same freight, which is the sound of professional soldiers naming the specific machine most likely to kill them. And I think there is something revealing in the fact that the German nickname was for an airplane, while the Allied nickname was for a gun that shot up at airplanes. That asymmetry is the whole war in miniature. By the summer of 1944, the psychological shift was complete, and the after-action reports German officers wrote for the U.S. Army after the war are unanimous on the point. They did not lose the sky at Falaise. They had already lost it. Falaise was simply the bill coming due, the moment the accumulated helplessness of 2 years turned into a specific traffic jam full of burning vehicles on a specific French road. The generals at Trent Park understood this even in captivity. The men in the tanks understood it sooner, because they were the ones who had to guess, every single morning, whether the road ahead of them was worth dying on. And so they reached for the only defense left to a man who cannot fight back and cannot outrun the thing hunting him. They reached for a paintbrush. Fritz Bayerlein moves what is left of the Panzer Lehr division at night now, and he does it the way a man handles something that will kill him if he holds it wrong. His division had been one of the best equipped armored formations in the German army, built from demonstration and training units, the pride of the Panzer Arm. On the 25th of July, near St. Lo, American heavy bombers had carpeted his forward positions in a raid that churned the ground into something the survivors compared to the surface of the moon. Bayerlein told his interrogators afterward that his division had been finally and completely annihilated from the air. His word, annihilated, and he was a man who chose words carefully. Whatever crawled out of those craters had learned a lesson the hard way, and the lesson rewrote every rule Bayerlein had ever been taught about how a column moves. The new doctrine worked as a system, not a set of tricks. The old German march order packed vehicles close, nose to tail, because tight spacing meant control, meant a commander could see his whole unit and turn it fast. That spacing was now a death sentence, because a tight column was a single target, and the Jabos pilot did not need to aim at anything in particular to hit something. So the spacing opened up. 50 meters between vehicles became 100, then more, until a company on the march sprawled across kilometers of road, and the commander lost the very control the old system had given him. Movement happened between dusk and dawn. In the 4 or 5 hours of real darkness a French summer allows, which meant a march that once took a single afternoon, now took 3 nights. Headlights were forbidden. Drivers followed the painted white differential housing of the vehicle ahead, or a man walked in front with a shielded lamp, and the column crawled forward at the speed of a man walking, because that was the speed the dark permitted. And every column now carried men whose only job was to watch the sky. The aircraft spotter, the Flugmelder, became as essential to a moving unit as the driver. He rode on the lead vehicle, or on several vehicles, scanning the horizon and the sun, because the Jabos like to come out of the sun, the way fighter pilots have come out of the sun since men first fought in the air. When he saw them, or heard them, he shouted or fired a flare, and the entire column performed a drill that had been rehearsed until it was reflex. Vehicles scattered off the road in both directions. Crews dove for the ditches. Drivers tried to get their machines under a tree, against a hedge, into the shadow of a farm building, anywhere that broke the clean outline a pilot looks for at 300 miles an hour. A German report from the period estimated that a well-drilled unit could clear the road in under a minute. A minute is a long time when a Thunderbolt is already rolling in. The cost of getting it wrong was total, and the men knew it, which is why the discipline held, even as everything else fell apart. The arithmetic of it carried its own particular horror. A tank crew that stayed buttoned up and hidden survived. A tank crew that panicked and ran for open ground in daylight died, and they died in a way that stripped away every advantage German engineering had given them. The Panther's frontal armor was among the best in the world, angled and thick, able to shrug off most Allied tank guns at range. None of that mattered when the attack came from above and behind, into the thin roof plate and the engine deck, where a rocket or a burst of .50 caliber found the fuel and the ammunition. The best tank in the world, killed through its worst plate by a pilot who would never know the crew's names. Bayerlein understood the exchange rate exactly. He was trading time, enormous amounts of time, to keep his vehicles alive, and time was the one thing an army trying to retreat across France did not have. Think about what that trade did to the German conduct of the battle. An armored counterattack depends on assembling force at a point faster than the enemy can react. The Panzer Division was a machine for doing exactly that, for concentrating tanks where they were not expected and hitting before the defender could shift. But concentration in daylight was suicide, and movement in daylight was suicide, so the German commander could only assemble his force at night in dispersed packets, arriving piecemeal and exhausted after crawling through the dark for hours. By the time the tanks were gathered and ready to strike, the moment they had been gathered to exploit was often gone, closed off, overtaken by an American advance that had continued moving all day under an umbrella of its own aircraft. The Wehrmacht had built the finest tactical instrument of maneuver warfare the world had yet seen, and American air power had reached down and unplugged its clock. So the new rules of the road held the division together, barely, for a while. Bayerlein kept what he could of Panzer Lehr alive by obeying them. But a man cannot hide a tank under a tree forever, and the Jabos had a way of finding the trees. What the German crews needed was to make the tank itself disappear, and for that the paint came out. Just before noon on the road out of Argenton, a Panther crew of the 2nd SS Panzer Division works with their hands in the dirt. The gunner is cutting branches from a roadside apple orchard with a bayonet, hacking green boughs still heavy with unripe fruit, and laying them across the engine deck. The loader is smearing mud, just mud, wet from a ditch, worked in with the flat of his hand, across the pale factory primer, showing through the worn camouflage on the turret. The commander stands on the hull and looks at his own tank the way a hunted animal checks its own shadow. From the air, he is trying to guess, does this 50-ton machine now read as a hedge, a bush, a smear of nothing, or does it still read as exactly what it is? He does not know, and that not knowing is the worst of it. He will only find out when the sound comes. The paint itself had a name and a system, because the Germans systematized everything. The factory scheme since 1943 was a base of dark yellow, Dunkelgelb, over which crews sprayed or brushed patches of red, brown, and olive green from paste that came in cans and was thinned with gasoline, water, whatever was on hand. In Normandy, that palette was wrong. The neat, hard-edged patterns designed for the open steppe stood out against apple orchards and Norman hedgerow. So the crews improvised, darkening the whole vehicle, breaking the yellow with mud and soot and foliage, until the disciplined factory scheme disappeared under a layer of field desperation. A tank that left the depot looking like a catalog illustration reached the front, looking like a rolling compost heap. And that was exactly what they wanted. The catalog illustration got you killed. The foliage was the real armor now, and every crew became obsessive about it. Branches went into every bracket and tie-down the vehicle carried, and where there were no brackets, the men wired them on. Whole saplings were lashed to the turret sides. The long gun barrel, the one clean straight line no bush in nature produces, got wrapped and draped until it looked like a fallen limb. Crews learned to read their own overhead signature, to think like the pilot 3,000 feet up, to hate the two things that betrayed them most, shadow and shine. A clean stretch of metal caught the sun and threw a wink of light visible for miles. A hard-edged shape threw a hard-edged shadow no tree ever cast. So they killed the shine with mud and broke the shadow with leaves, and then they moved, and the leaves dried and browned within hours and had to be cut fresh again at the next halt. A retreating panzer crew in August 1944 spent as much time gardening as fighting. None of it was enough, and here is where the noon on that road turned into something the survivors carried for the rest of their lives. The Flugmelder on the lead half-track hears them first. That particular deep drone of Pratt & Whitney radials, 4 of them, coming low from the west with the sun behind. He screams and fires his flare, and the column dies where it stands. Engines cut. Men pour off the vehicles and into the ditches on both sides, and the SS commander, who spent an hour dressing his Panther in apple branches, does the only thing left to do, which is throw himself face down in French mud and press his helmet into the earth and wait. The first Thunderbolt comes down the road at treetop height. The sound arrives as physical pressure, the 850s opening up with a tearing roar that is not like anything in nature, a sound men described afterward as canvas ripping next to the ear amplified 1,000 times. Rounds walk up the roadway in twin lines of dust and sparks. The half-track that carried the spotter takes the burst and lifts and comes apart, and the fuel goes, and a column of oily black climbs into the clear summer sky as a marker for the next pilot. The branches did not save that half-track. Sometimes they saved the tank beside it. That was the whole cruel lottery of it. The camouflage did not make you safe. It made you slightly harder to pick out of a line of targets. And slightly harder was the entire difference between the crew that drove away at dusk and the crew that did not. The commander in the ditch does not lift his head until the drone fades east and the ammunition in the burning half-track stops cooking off. Then he stands, and he checks his tank, and the apple branches are still there, browning already, and the machine is intact. He has won this round of a game he did not choose and cannot quit. In 3 hours, he will play it again. Multiply that scene by every road out of the pocket, every hour of every day for a week. The mud, the branches, the diving into ditches, the standing up to count who was still alive. American pilots reported the roads themselves seemed to smoke, columns of black rising every few miles where a vehicle had been caught in the open. A German soldier wrote of the stench that hung over the whole region, diesel and cordite, and burned flesh and dead horses swelling in the heat. The Wehrmacht had learned to hide a tank under leaves. What it had not learned, what no amount of paint or foliage could teach it, was how to move an army under a sky that belonged to someone else. A low gray ceiling of cloud on the morning of the 17th of August is the most beautiful thing a panzer crewman near Troon has ever seen. The men stand in the wet dawn with their faces tilted up, reading the sky the way a farmer reads it, and what they are hoping for is not sun but the opposite. Thick weather, rain, a solid overcast that would ground the Jabos and give them a full day to move in the open, like soldiers instead of vermin. The overcast holds until mid-morning. For those hours, the roads fill with vehicles moving in daylight, engines running hot, drivers making up the distance they could not cover in the 4 hours of true dark. Then, a little before 11, the cloud begins to thin and break, and the first patches of blue open overhead like trapdoors, and every man on that road feels his stomach drop, because he knows what blue sky means now. It means they are coming. The weather had been the only general on the German side who ever won a battle in Normandy, and the weather was leaving the field. This is the thing that has to be understood about the last week of the pocket. The Wehrmacht had surrendered the initiative so completely that its entire operational tempo was set by cloud cover, not by model, not by Klug, not by any decision made at any headquarters, by barometric pressure. A German staff officer's planning question was no longer where to attack or where to hold, but simply this: how many hours of darkness and bad visibility can we count on? And how far can a column crawl in that window before the sky clears and kills it? Meteorology had become the senior arm of service. Crews learned the sky better than any pilot, memorized the way a particular haze meant an hour's grace, prayed for the storms that rolled through, and cursed the high pressure that brought the clear, cold mornings the Jabos pilots loved. I have read a fair number of these accounts, and the detail that stays with me is not the fear, which is expected, but the wishing. Grown men, professional soldiers of the finest army in Europe, reduced to willing rain clouds into existence over a French field, and the foliage. By the third week of August, there was not enough of it left. An armored division moving through the same 20-mile stretch of countryside for days had stripped the roadside trees bare, cut every low branch, hacked the orchards down to the trunk, until crews were fighting over the remaining greenery like scavengers. A tank that reached a fresh hedgerow at dawn had its pick. A tank that arrived an hour later found the hedge already skeletonized by the vehicles ahead, the good boughs taken, nothing left but twigs that fooled no one. Men climbed trees to reach branches the earlier columns could not, or drove off the road entirely into standing crops to break the outline against something, anything, that still had leaves on it. The camouflage that was supposed to be their salvation had become another shortage to fight over, ranked somewhere alongside fuel and ammunition and morphine in the ledger of things the retreating army was running out of. The clear afternoon of the 18th turned the Falaise road into the thing the American pilots would remember for the rest of their lives. Typhoons and thunderbolts worked the pocket in relays, and there was no need for cleverness anymore, no need to hunt. The targets were packed axle to axle for miles, a solid river of German steel with nowhere to go, and the pilots simply queued up and took their turns. They hit the front of a column and the back of it, and then worked the trapped middle at leisure. A rocket into a fuel truck, and the vehicles ahead and behind burned with it. Horses. And there were thousands of horses, because the German army in 1944 still moved most of its guns and supplies with animals, broke their traces, and ran in flame through the wreckage, and their screaming was a sound that Allied pilots, men in metal 3,000 feet up who could hear nothing over their own engines, somehow reported hearing in their memories anyway. Quentin Aanenson, the P-47 pilot from the opening of the story, flew missions like these and came back and was physically sick, and wrote later that he had done things he could not reconcile with the person he had been raised to be. His word for it was not glory. His word was slaughter. The Panther commander of the 2nd SS, the one who dressed his tank in apple branches and won his round of the lottery outside Argenton, did not win the next one. The records do not tell us his name or the exact hour, and that silence tells you something about how these men ended. Somewhere on the road between Trun and Chambois, in the clear killing light of a fine August afternoon, the machine that his crew had smeared with mud and hung with browning leaves and prayed over gave up its clean straight gun barrel to a pilot's eye, and a rocket found the engine deck, and the best tank in the world burned through its thinnest plate exactly as the arithmetic said it would. The rain the Germans waited for came at last in early September. By then, there was almost nothing left in the pocket to keep dry. The gap between Trun and Chambois is perhaps 6 kilometers wide on the morning of the 19th, and a Wehrmacht supply officer named Herbert, whose surname the interrogation file records only as an initial, is trying to push a column of horse-drawn wagons and a handful of surviving vehicles through the last open ground before the Americans and the Poles seal it. The road ahead of him is not a road anymore. It is a single continuous wreck, kilometer after kilometer of overturned wagons, burned trucks, dead horses stacked 3 deep, where a strafing run caught a team in harness, and the debris does not clear because there is nowhere to push it. His men drag a shattered limber off the crown of the road, and the space fills again within minutes, with the next column pressing from behind. Overhead, the sky is the clear, hard blue they have all learned to dread. He can hear the engines already, circling, waiting, the way birds wait over a thing that is not quite finished dying. There was no camouflage for this. The whole architecture of survival the panzer crews had built, the branches, the mud, the darkness, the spacing, the drilled dive for the ditch, depended on one thing above all, that a vehicle could keep moving and find cover between attacks. In the corridor, there was no moving and there was no cover. 20,000 vehicles and 88,000 men, by the German army's own later reckoning, were funneling toward a gap a few kilometers wide, and the traffic had congealed into a solid mass that could not disperse because dispersal requires room, and there was none. A tank could be painted the color of the earth itself, and it did not matter, because it was locked bumper to bumper in a river of steel that the Jabos pilots could see from 20 miles out. The Falaise pocket stripped away the last illusion the crews had been living inside. Concealment only works for a target that can also move. Take away the movement, and the paint is just decoration on a coffin. The pilots called it a target-rich environment, which is the kind of clean, bloodless phrase men invent when the truth is unspeakable. What they were actually doing was killing a trapped army from a range at which nothing could touch them, hour after hour, in relays, until the barrels of the 50s glowed and the rocket rails ran empty, and they flew back to rearm and returned to find the targets still there, still packed, still burning. The 2nd Tactical Air Force and the American 9th flew nearly 3,000 sorties against the pocket in the space of days. Down in the corridor, the men stopped even diving for the ditches, because the ditches were full of the dead and the dying, and because there was no longer any point. Eisenhower walked the ground himself 2 days after it ended, and the sentence he wrote afterward has outlived every other description of the place. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas, he went on, and this is the part that matters. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. That is the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, a man not given to melodrama, telling you what the sky had done to the ground. Herbert survived, which is why there is a file with his initial in it. He was taken prisoner on the 20th, walking west with his hands laced behind his head, past the wreck of everything he had spent 5 days trying to save, and in his interrogation, he said the thing that this entire story has been driving toward. He said his men had come to believe that the paint and the branches were a lie they told themselves, a ritual to keep their hands busy while they waited to find out whether the pilot 3,000 feet up had chosen them or the vehicle in front. You cannot hide an army, he said, when the army cannot move. There is no color for that. I have thought about that line for a long time. The German soldier of 1944 was the product of the most sophisticated tactical culture any army had yet produced, heir to the doctrine that had conquered the continent in 6 weeks, and the war had reduced him to a man smearing mud on steel and praying to a cloud. The camouflage was never the failure. The camouflage was the symptom. The failure was that the United States and its allies had taken the sky so completely that the finest ground army in the world could only exist at night, in the rain, in the 4 dark hours, a summer grants, and an army that can only exist part-time is already beaten. It just does not know the hour yet. Roughly 10,000 Germans died in the pocket, and 50,000 marched into captivity. And the ones who escaped came out the far side of the Seine, having abandoned nearly all their heavy equipment on the roads behind them. The Panthers with the best frontal armor in the world were among that wreckage, their engine decks torn open, their gun barrels still wrapped in the brown skeletons of apple branches cut a week before near Argentan. The branches had outlasted the men who cut them. They had never had a chance of saving them. 19 days. That is how long it took, from the fall of Saint-Lô to the closing of the Gap, for the German army in the West to be taught a lesson it would carry until the last week of the war. That daylight movement in the presence of the Allied air arm was a form of suicide, and that the lesson applied everywhere, forever, regardless of terrain or season, or how badly the ground situation demanded a march at noon. The men who wrote it down were the German generals themselves, and they wrote it for the United States Army. After the surrender, the Historical Division put dozens of captured senior officers to work, producing what became the Foreign Military Studies, thousands of manuscripts on how the Wehrmacht had fought and lost. Read enough of them, and the same phrase surfaces again and again in different hands, the way a bruise shows through skin. Feindliche Luftüberlegenheit, enemy air superiority. Fritz Bayerlein, who had moved Panzer Lehr through the Norman Nights like a man carrying nitroglycerin, told his American interrogators flatly that his division had been unable to conduct any movement by day. General Freiherr von Luttwitz put it in terms of arithmetic, that a march which should have taken a single night now took 3, because the columns could only crawl in darkness and had to be dispersed and hidden before first light. The pattern in these reports is not complaint, it is confession. Those documents establish the following, in the enemy's own words and against his own professional pride. The Allied tactical air forces did not merely destroy German vehicles. They destroyed the German ability to decide when and where to move them, which is the deeper thing, because maneuver was the entire foundation of the doctrine that had beaten Poland and France and driven deep into Russia. Blitzkrieg was speed, and speed was daylight, and daylight was now closed to them. General Major Rudolf Freiherr von Gersdorf wrote that the psychological effect on the troops was greater than the material damage, that men who had heard the drone of engines over the Falaise road flinched at their own aircraft for the rest of the war. A staff study prepared under General Gunther Blumentritt described how the movement of reserves, the resupply of ammunition, the simple act of concentrating force at the decisive point, all of it had to be recalculated around the hours of darkness. An army that cannot concentrate cannot counterattack. An army that cannot counterattack can only retreat and retreat and retreat until it reaches a river it cannot cross or a border it cannot hold. And the force that did this was not larger than the army it broke. That is the part I keep returning to. The Jabos squadrons over Normandy were flown by a few thousand pilots in a few thousand aircraft against a continental army of millions with the finest armor and the deepest tactical tradition in Europe. The Ninth Air Force and its British partners did not outnumber the Wehrmacht. They outproduced it, outflew it, and outthought it, and they turned the sky itself into a weapon that made the ground army's greatest strength, its ability to move and mass and strike, into a liability that got men killed. When the Germans tried the same doctrine again in December, in the Ardennes, they built the entire plan around a forecast of bad weather, because they knew by then that the only way to move a panzer army was to do it under a sky the Allied pilots could not see through. The clouds held for a week. Then, 4 days before Christmas, the weather broke clear over the Ardennes, and the Jabos came, and it ended the way Falaise had ended. They had learned the lesson perfectly. The lesson simply had no answer. Quentin Aanenson flew until his tour was finished and lived to be an old man in Louisiana, and late in his life he sat in front of a camera and tried to explain what those roads had done to him, and could not always finish the sentences. He had killed efficiently, and he had come home and been sick in the grass beside his aircraft, both things true, neither canceling the other. That is the honest shape of it. The men who broke the German army over Normandy did not do it cleanly and did not feel clean afterward, and the ones worth listening to never pretended otherwise. The war did not pause for any of them to reflect. On the morning after the gap closed, the squadrons were briefed again, armed again, and sent east after the columns streaming toward the Seine, because a beaten army is still an army until it is across the water, and there were still targets on the roads. The pilots climbed into the same clear late August sky and went looking for the same drab shapes hiding under the same browning branches, and they found them, and it started over. On the road between Troon and Chambois, in a field a French farmer would spend the next decade clearing, a Panther of the 2nd SS sat burned down to its running gear. The turret canted, the long gun barrel drooping toward the mud. Wired to the barrel, blackened but still recognizable, were the stubs of apple branches, cut green near Argenton, on a morning a week earlier, by men who believed the leaves might be enough. The steel would rust there through the autumn rains. The branches were already gone to ash.